어디?
Yeah, we are continuing our lesson on the biblical background, focusing on character study. So, character study in the Old Testament. And in this discussion, by looking at the characters in the Bible, we are trying to get the message from a narrative or a story. And that's one of the ways to understand and search and research the Bible. So this is where we stopped last week. This will be week number 6. And let me give you an announcement for next week. Week number 7. I will be out of town, so we don't have in-person class. So instead, I'm gonna record another portion for next week today, and we'll have that on our internet site. So for next week, please do not come to the class, but just watch me and watch the lecture on the internet, okay, on the school website. All right. So I just want you to know that we don't have in-person class next week, no. But there's gonna be class online. How do you picture a person? This has been one of the human topics, or this human problem or issues since probably the beginning of human history. People had the ways and the means and the theories regarding how to see or analyze or understand a person. So I'll just briefly list some of the examples of this attempt to understand a person. Because a character study is basically we're trying to understand a person in the story. That's where we are. So how these people in the history, in the past, how they would have tried or attempt to understand a person may give some insights for us. Even studying the Bible and the biblical characters, we would know what to look for by looking at some of these ideas or the theories. Okay. Aristotle, one of the famous philosopher in a Greco-Roman world. Even they did Aristotle, and then there are several of them. But he said, person or people are political animal or animals. Because the politic was a big thing in the time of Aristotle. They were the ones the first ones as far as we know in human history, who had tried to establish a democratic society or democratic politics. And from his point of view, whether it's a democratic or whatever, the human beings are very political animals. That by saying that, he is saying that distinction between the animal and the human being is that we are doing some politics, not like or unlike animals. Animals don't have politics. Some social animals may have some politics, limited politics, but not like us. We are very complex, complicated political animals. Do we see any political or politics in the Bible stories? Yes, we do. We do have many political elements in the Bible studies, in the Bible narratives. And so it is important for us sometimes to look into these political issues. For example, when Jesus was indicted, meaning that he was charged with a crime of trying to revolt against the Roman authority and against the given religious authority of Jewish culture. That was his charges. And it's a political charges that Jesus was against. So there definitely is these political matters. Another example, as we try to understand the story of Jesus, there's one of the disciples whose name is Iscariot Judas. He's the one who sold Jesus to the authorities, and he's the one who pointed, this is the Jesus that you guys are looking for. He thought that Jesus is going to be the political Messiah, meaning that he is going to liberate Jewish people, the Israel, from the Roman colonists. So he's following Jesus, or his discipleship, or his loyalty for Jesus was motivated basically by his political ambition. He thought, if I follow this guy, who's going to be the king of Israel, later, when he becomes a king, I'll have one very powerful position. That's what he was looking for. Very politically motivated reason to follow Jesus. So, as we study these Bible stories and their characters, some of them are very politically motivated or politically involved, and then it influences their decision, their words, and their actions. So it is worthwhile to look into these political elements or domain of a character. Buddha. The Buddhism is one of the major religions in Asian culture. From India to Tibet to China, Mongolia, and all these Southeastern Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and then Korea and Japan. All these areas are influenced by Buddhist religion. And one of the major teachings of Buddha is this: we should empty ourselves or de-self, deny ourselves, and find peace in being united with the nature and the universe. So that's basically what Buddha is teaching. It's very conceptual. It's very ambiguous sometimes, but the idea of there's a self that is very dirty and very egoistic and greedy, and it's very common to all the religions, including Judaism, Christianity, Catholicism, and Islamic religion. All these good major religions talks about emptying ourselves, because there are evil things in us. So that's a common idea. We can easily say it is truth that human beings have these very negative, dark, and selfish desire inside. So when we look for the characters in the Bible, it's the same thing. And we can apply that principle into the study of biblical characters and see how his or her actions and words are motivated by the selfish, greed, and ego, and self-centeredness, and desire to gain his or her own profit or benefits. So, even if it's not Buddha's teaching, we know that people have this very dark self inside, negative self. Now, Confucius, most Asian cultures, major Asian cultures, are greatly influenced by this Confucius ideal or philosophy or teachings. He did taught many things, but one of the things that we like to address is that he taught us we need to be ethically very excellent, and he suggests very very high standard for ethical measure. And he teaches a lot of these detailed ethical principles and then way of relating to other people. And another teachings of Confucius philosophy is that people are ranked, and then it is important for us to accept and live within that ranks or hierarchies. So there's designated, born to be high, and there are people who are born to be low. This idea of hierarchy in human society, or order of hierarchy, or the rank of people or classes of people, is one of the common idea throughout the global civilization or global cultures. Even in a very so-called primitive, I don't like the word, but just for the understanding for the sake of communication, so-called primitive cultures or the tribal cultures, they do have this hierarchic structure. So in understanding the biblical character, because the ancient Jewish culture, even still today, I think, but the most of cultures do have this hierarchic system, and so is in the Bible. Jewish culture is very sophisticated and a systematic, structured society. There's a king and then slave. King to slave is very hierarchic structure. And also, Bible demands in the Old Testament, especially in the Old Testament, because we are focusing on Old Testament characters. In the Old Testament, you see very high ethical standard. There is like 900 some detailed laws or regulations or instructions that you need to follow as a Jewish person, and these high ethical standard is pretty similar to what Confucius taught his disciples. So we also look into these ethical elements in the characters. Some are very ethical, some are not so ethical. Some are moral, some are immoral. And that kind of characterizes a character in the Bible. And that helps us to understand the story better. When you determine and to analyze and try to understand how ethical this person is. Let me give you one example from the story of King David. King David was a good king, a powerful king, but in the course of his kingship, he committed some of the immoral acts. For example, there's a married woman whose name is Bathsheba, and he kind of find her attractive, and then he builds a plan, premeditated plan to kill her husband. He doesn't kill directly, but he sends him to the very front of the war zone, which grants him to be killed. And eventually he does get killed, and then he takes his wife as his. So it's a murder plus adultery by biblical standard. And he is being unethical, immoral, and that kind of characterized David as a king who had committed a very immoral act. Later he confessed and he repented about that sin. And also, as we look at the ethical issues, we need to see how this character, how this person, whether he or she responds and reacts to the sins or immoral, unethical things that he or she committed. So that's one of the things that we look for in the study of biblical characters. Saint Augustine. So far, these people are not Christians, but Saint Augustine is one of the famous so-called saints in the early Christian history. And he said, we are a spiritual being. Now, we do see some of the spiritual elements in the story in the history, and Saint Augustine sees us as a spiritual being, and he's saying we are totally spiritual being. So by doing that, he kind of ignores another aspect of human existence. Again, here's I'm continuing to give you this formula. If you have been to my class before, we know this is one of the fundamental formula that we want to repeat, because it is very useful in understanding the Bible's stories and also understanding our own existence or own story. So there are two realities in human existence. One that's visible. We have to eat, we have to sleep, we have to dress up, and we have to work. And we get sick, and we need to be treated. And there is so-called routine, everyday things to survive. Some people think that's not spiritual. That's very physical, and that's secondary to human existence. That's not how I believe. For me, as an evangelical Christian, and trying to balance as much as possible, and trying to be holistic as much as possible, according to the Bible doesn't teach your life as a life in this secular, so-called secular domain of making money or trying to be healthy and wealthy. These are basic human needs and desires. There's nothing wrong to become trying to be healthy and wealthy. What matters is how you become wealthy and healthy. If you have to deceive someone or get something, take away something from someone, or even harm someone for you to become wealthy or healthy or whatever, then it becomes a very big issue. What I'm trying to say here is what we call routine, normal, and secular things or existence is as much important as our spiritual existence. So when you read the Bible and when you see the characters in the Bible, Old Testament, they do live and they do work and they get married, they do fight and they have conflicts, they do feel jealous about someone else, and they do get, all these routine everyday existence is there. And the reason the Bible is recording these elements is because there are that domain of existence, so-called the spiritual existence or spiritual being, that is important, but other side is as much as important. So Augustine, he's the one who kind of begins so-called dichotomy, trying to divide human existence into two. The problem is, it is true that there are so-called spiritual domain and non-spiritual domain in human existence, just like I explained. But the problem is when you think or you begin to say this non-spiritual domain or side of human existence is less important or not even important as the spiritual like a prayer and coming to worship and reading the Bible. Well, that is spiritual, but for me, the spiritual is whole human existence is spiritual. So even though you can kind of divide is spiritual and non-spiritual, both are important. Dichotomy by the contrast is saying this life or this existence is less important or non-important as much as so-called spiritual existence. That's why some of the church goers or Christians, so-called Christians, are so focused on this spiritual existence, they just do not or ignore the other side. And many of these cults are saying you don't need to go to school because the Jesus' second coming is very close, and you don't need to work, and we just live together and we can survive within ourselves. And they say don't go to school, don't earn money, and don't get married, all these things. And that's wrong. Biblically speaking, it's very wrong. So dichotomy is one of the enemies to biblical perspective. This is not biblical. But still, many Christians today, even today, many so-called good Christians, they think the spiritual life is much important, regular, normal life that we need to sustain. So there is that strong tendency. I mean, I can speak for the Korean church or Korean churches in America. There are still many, probably more believers who believe that a so-called spiritual thing is more important. Briggs and Meyer. Somehow I London studied and did my MBTI test like almost 25 years ago. But somehow in Korea, this thing is big. So everyone talking about MBTI. This is one of the ways to trying to kind of analyze or picture a person in its psychology and trait and character. There are like 16 different categories that you can fall into. But we have like hundreds, millions people who are very different. But that it does help you to understand who you are and who others are. For example, it talks about introvert and extrovert. Introverts are those who are rather shy and rather with a less talkative and less active in making relationships. On the other end, extroverts are the ones who enjoy being with other people, very talkative and very active in making friends and so on. So there are two different kind of traits on that aspect. So there are 4 different categories that you analyze yourself, and it ends up with 16 different combinations. And it is kind of suggested or invented or theorized by Briggs-Meyer or Myers-Briggs. They're the ones who began this kind of test or give the grid or suggestion for understanding human trait. That helps. Certainly there are introverts or extroverts. There are those who are very rational to emotional, or left brain or right brain. And there are those who are thinking and those who are judging, so TJ. So these are the helpful tool to use in understanding a person, and that can apply to a person in the story. For example, in New Testament, Peter is the one who is very extrovert. He's the one who wants to speak out, and he's the one who initiates most of things. And he is the one who makes most mistakes, and thus he is the one who is most recorded in the New Testament gospel. On the other hand, John, not the Baptist, but John, the disciple, he's the one who is rather introvert. He's very shy. He follows Jesus very closely, but there's no record of John saying anything significant in the story of gospel. So we see these very contrast characters in the story of Jesus. Freud, Sigmund Freud, is one of the modern so-called psychologists who had developed these theories of the analysis of mind or psychology. So he's sometimes called the father of modern psychology. And one of the major elements in his theory of human understanding is so-called ego. Ego is something that, or idea or ego, as they combine, is some essence of human existence. So he puts reality times ego or idea to understand human existence. And he tried to explain human behavior and human thinking and human existence with this element of ego. And also he gave this one of the input of the sexual desire as one of the major elements that drives ego. So he thinks many, even if it's not all, many of human actions or human existence is driven by sexual greed and desire. That's how we understood a human being. I think he has some truth in understanding. I mean, we cannot explain everything that we do with that greed and element of ego, but when you read the Bible, it is true that all these characters in the Bible, whether they are good ones or bad ones, they do have a certain ego, selfishness, and self-centeredness in their existence. So Sigmund Freud is the one who translated biblical idea of sin or sins into the word ego. He just replaced the wording to ego or idea or greed. And that's a sin. Basically, human have this sin, which is a very selfishness and self-centeredness and greed. So Freud kind of has his own insight and perspective about human understanding that kind of it was raised from or derived from biblical teachings. Maslow is another famous Western psychologist who tried to understand human in terms of needs. While Sigmund Freud tried to understand the human existence or human psychology in terms of wants, and he tried to understand human being with the term or the concept of needs. Needs are like you have need to survive. You have need to eat to survive. You need to have a shelter. You need to have coverings, and you need to have security, and you need to have self-esteem, and you need to have self-actualization. That's how it kind of ranked, built a hierarchy of need, beginning from the basic need. So this is one of the things that you may have learned already in your study. If you have done some, if you had a basic unit in psychology, or you are familiar with this Maslow's pyramid. They're basing it at the top as a self-actualization. You need to achieve. You need to be somebody. You need to be, worth. So this is where the meaning comes in. What is the meaning of my existence? The answer is, you have to find your answer. No one's going to give you the answer or an answer. And the Bible also tried to answer that very needs of us asking, who am I? Why am I here? What is the significance of my existence? And if you're old over like 18, an adult, then you should have the answer to that very question. But sadly and unfortunately, today's young people, to my understanding, because I've been working with the young people since when I was in college, and my ministry and my work as a pastor is focused on the younger people, always been. So I know many of today's generation, 20 or older, or 18 or older, so-called adults, they do not. Most of them do not have the answer, or even an answer to that very question of the existence. Or many of them are very confused and have wrong answer to the question. The wrong answer, I could say, in today's society, everything is relative, and they say there is no truth. Whatever you choose to believe is the truth. Now, that's not the case. I don't think that's the case. There are valid answers and not valid answers. One of the not valid answers to the question of asking, who am I? What's the meaning of my existence? What's the significance of my existence that is given? Is, success, money, pleasure. These are some of the answers that are given in today's modern society. I think that's a pretty much same, whether you're raised in a socialist culture like China, or a half democratic culture in Korea. When I grew up, it was half democratic. It's not fully. Or community culture in Japan. Today's young people all around these areas and in the world are given these three answers. You need to be powerful, rich, and famous. And you need to enjoy yourself. You have a right to enjoy, but that, not on someone else's cost or someone else's existence. You don't do that. That's not pleasure. That's not joy. But today, the media and the schools, even the teachers, and even the government are teaching you to be that. Karl Marx. Karl Marx and then Engels are the two well-known characters in history who have begun or laid the foundation for so-called communism. And that's where the so-called communists came on. But the funny thing is, the communism they begin to theorize and preach it's based on the Bible. Because in the Bible, in Acts of Apostles, there's a so-called community or the church that exactly practice that so-called communism. They said they just gave up their right to possess anything and shared it together and shared it evenly, so no one is more rich than others. And that's the same for a while. But that communism did not last that long because of that human ego and human sinfulness and human needs, and then wants and greed. And the thing that I'm trying to say from Karl Marx or Engels' perspective on human as a person is, he says we are economic animals, while Aristotle said we are political animals. They said we are economical or economic animals. Money is the thing, or possession is the thing that drives a human being, and that's the root or the foundation of evil. So his resolution is that no one claims possession. And if there's no possession, then we can share these resources together and we'll be happy, because there is no need for us to fight or make a classes, ruling or unruling, or so-called bourgeois to rule over the working classes. So his way of seeing a person is we are economic animals, and like animals, you are trying to get whatever you want by fighting against the other animals, and the eating chain or the chain of the consumption is created even in human existence. So that's how Karl Marx saw it. I mean, even if we do not totally agree with these perspectives, each perspective gives us some truth, some idea about how we understand a person. So when we read this Bible characters, we do apply some of these or all of these insights as we try to understand a biblical character or characters. Okay, characteristics. I think that's the correct way to write in Chinese characters. Let's say a feature or a quality belonging typically to a person, a place, or thing, and serving to identify it. So for us, it's kind of thing, that quality that identifies a person and kind of distinguish or differentiate a person A to person B. Every person has a very unique, distinctive characteristic or characteristics, just like our fingerprints are not the same. Every human being, their fingerprints are different, and it stays different for a lifetime. So it's the characteristics. Some characteristics that you're born with. We do have a different name for it, but just we'll include it in here for the purpose of this class. Then another word would be trait. That's pretty much the same as characteristic, but different wording. A distinguishing quality or characteristic typically one belongs to a person. So while in Korean we read 성격, I think it sounds similar in Chinese. 성격 and then 개성. 개성 would be the trait, would be the part of the characteristic. So there are some characters that are common for all the human beings, but there is something that kind of distinguish a person to a person, and especially for that we call it trait. And then we have something called temperament. For me, temperament is something that you're born with. While the characteristic is something that you learn as you grow up. It is something that you formulate and you develop. So this characteristic is largely influenced by your background, your parents, your siblings, where you live, who you live with, and how you live, whether you're rich or poor, or what school you attended. So there are these hundreds of different elements that influences and formulate your characteristics. But this temperament, in Korean we read 기질. 기질 is something that you are innate. It's that something that you're born with, and it permanently affects your existence. The thing is, you may try to change your temperament, but it's very difficult. So for me, when I try to counsel a person, my students or disciples, I try to see these two things. There's something that she or he is born with, so that's something that you cannot change. And it's who you are. I mean, it's like an apple is an apple, and a banana is banana. You cannot change apple to banana. But for banana, there is a green banana, red banana, or a big banana, long one, short one. So is the apple. There is like a apple that is big, that is small, that is more red or rather green. So these colors or size or the shape of a fruit is like a characteristic that can be, it can be changed by someone's influence or from within. You can try to change your characteristic or 성격, and while this 기질 or temperament is given, it stays with you. So the best thing to do is to utilize your temperament in a very positive way. So you'll sustain, you cannot change temperament, you use it in a positive way. So you'll be who you are. It's who you are basically. But the characteristics you can develop, you can change the way it fits, your temperament. So characteristic, trait, temperament are used in English. It's used somewhat very interchangeably. It doesn't have that very clear distinction. But in this, as we read in Chinese character, for me in Korean or in Chinese characters, there's a certain distinction. We know what it means when we say this and 기질. Okay. Yeah, let's take a short break and
Okay.
we'll come back.
Okay.
Okay. So we are back, and let us continue our discussion. Another 15 minutes, and we'll be okay. Personality. I mean, in English, there's no like a quite distinction. It's not that clear, but in the Chinese character, we know that what that means. It's Song Pun, or turn on Pun Song, reading from that side too. It's something that you have as a good quality, even bad quality. It's a virtue, a quality that an individual, a person has. And by looking at this personality, you determine who this person is, whether this person is a good person or a bad person. So there is a good personality and bad personality. In Asian culture, this is very important, and especially in Confucius ideal or the philosophy or Confucianism, this personality is highly emphasized, and the education basically is to formulate or to create a good personality in a children. Nowadays, no longer that is the case. The school is trying to put large amount of knowledge instead of creating or formulating, developing a personality. That's a major difference between the school when I was in school and today's school, and I'm very worried. So when we study biblical characters, what we are trying to see mainly is his personality, whether this person, he or she, is a person of God or not. That's how we determine a personality in the Bible. So there is certainly who are the person of God and who are not, or in between. So for even today, how us, the Christians, divide a person or distinguish a person is whether this person is a real Christian or non-believer or in between. They're the so-called Christians who are not really a Christian. And there are so-called Christians who are deceiving himself or herself, and then just trying to get the advantage of being called Christian. And then those who deny God or do not believe in God at all. So that's how we see a character in the Bible. And then persona. Persona is a psychology, a word in psychology, or a word in literature study. When you study literature, a persona is the character or the inner person that represent or true of who this person is. So in other words, it's a true character, or real character of a person, or the image of that person. So it says the aspect of someone's character that is presented to or perceived by others. So persona can be used in that definition, or a true person inside of a human being. personal. Now, humanness of a person. What makes a person a human? I didn't use the Chinese character. That's how we right. And in for us in Asian culture, person and human is the same thing. But not all person or all people are human. In Western world, when we use the word human, it means a person with a good humanness. That it means that we are different than animals. We are not animals. We are above animals. There are certain dignity and certain quality that kind of makes us or put us above animals. That's what a human in English concept is. So person, not all person are human. See, there are those who are subhuman or even worse than animals. We see that in today's world, a lot of them. And what is the difference between God and man? That defines human, because God is not superhuman, but God is beyond human, according to the Bible. The Bible does not say God is like a superhuman who has more power and more insight or knowledge. That's not how we picture God in the Bible. God is beyond human. It's a different level. But what Bible teaches us is that we have received our humanness or being human from the character of God. So God has created us to have that quality, same quality that God has. Not the ability, but the quality, the person, in a person into us. And so that's, when we talk about humanness, it is we use that word, godliness. Godliness means something, the quality of God. So quality of God is given to us and thus make us a human being. I'm not just saying it, but in the Bible, and if you read the first book of Bible, the Genesis, chapter 1, 26, it says, God said, let us make man in our image and our likeness. In our image and in our likeness. So God is deciding and He's claiming that we are, the human being, are built with that very quality, the image of God. So the image of God is not saying the shape, but the quality, in the quality, that humanness, that very godliness is given to every single human being. And that's where the God and we are kind of overlaps. So to change the picture. So there is something that is overlapping. That is godliness, the image of God that is given to us. Then next question. What is the difference between man and animals, or human and animals? That's a very ancient question, and people try to answer that. But Bible says men are spiritual being, while animal is just physical being. So some animals they do think, they have some logics, they have some rational, limited, even though it's limited. They do have animals do. I believe they do have some mind. So thinking and mind is kind of overlaps, just like God and man overlaps with the same pattern. There's something that's kind of overlapping, and I think it's thinking, thoughts, and animals. Some animals do think, but they are physical. They don't have no spirit, while man does have spirit. So that's the difference. Because of that, we try to understand man as a spiritual being. And being spiritual is major part of humanness. I think it's kind of draw it.
Yes, I think this one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this one is correct.
Yeah, that's a humanness. So that's kind of quality only the human has, and that's what makes a human, or man a human. Next, not there, that word, inga. It's in Korean we say inga, and then the Chinese character 이격체. I think you have your ways of pronouncing. So many words, I mean vocabularies in Korean, it came from the Chinese word. So if you use like a highly sophisticated language in Korean, then helpful would be that be able to write in Chinese characters. So what makes a human a person? Actually, that's the other way around. What makes a person a human? That's the way it should be written. I think it's wrong. So what makes a person a human? Again, man, a spiritual being, then that's godliness. Without godliness, a person is just a person a little better than animals, more complex than animals. We can communicate, use a language, and you can use tools, you can use technology. That will make a better being than animals. But without godliness, it's just like animals. There's not much difference. So once you remove or eliminate or take away that spiritual element in a person, then you are not a human. How would you fragment and compartment a person? That will be something that we need to go further into, because there are many different ways or theories of doing that. Okay, look at the science. Science is systemizing and organizing. When we talk about science in general term, usually we refer to so-called natural science or physical science. But for us today, as we in academic institution, when we say science, it doesn't, not only it means natural science or physical science like biology or physiology, physics, it includes this. But any academic systematic approach to the subject matter, whether it's theology, whether it's psychology, whether it's sociology, whether it's literature, any field of study. By the way, what was your major in college?
Actually, my major is Japanese.
Japanese. Okay. So learning Japanese or language, it is still a science. And if we're, students of a higher education, everything, every subject, even today, even the art sometimes is categorized into the field of science, but I think that's too much. I'll try to separate art and science, but science, it covers most of academic fields that we study today. So when you do science, it has to be systematic and it has to be organizing. If you're to be systematic and organizing, it always includes these elements of so-called parameters. Parameters are the boundaries. So you begin to draw boundaries. And by drawing boundaries, you automatically categorize or classify. And to classify, for example, this pyramid of Maslow. See, it says basic needs, or needs for survival, in other words. And then it says self-realization at the top. See, once you set the parameters, the boundaries, then you have these categories. Once you categorize or to set the parameters, you need something called grids or categories. Grids are like these are grids. So vertical and horizontal, they're like two different categories. Criteria is one of these. It's a measurement, whether it's kilogram, centimeters. There is an example of criteria, or length, or weight, or height, or amount. These are examples of criteria. So in studying a biblical character, whether it's the Old Testament, New Testament, or characters in any literature, you need to have these things to be scientific about your character study. So we need to have parameters for understanding character, categories of characters, and grids for understanding and analyzing every individual, and then also criteria to identify or make a judgment or select, and so on. And if you're a student of physical science, biology, and all this natural science, these will be the very familiar terms. But for the study of liberal arts, like a sociology, language, and so on, we don't use this that much, but still, there are these elements in doing any science. Again, continuing on this system and organizing barometers. Barometers are the instrument that used to measure a pressure, the air pressure in weather. And so we adopt that term, and when we say barometers, it's again it's kind of category or measuring relative heaviness, and it's more like a relative categories comparing A to B. So if you want to compare A to B, and then certainly we need to have certain barometers to measure that. Or standards. Standards are like a average measure, and either you are above standard or below standard or beyond the standard or extra standard. So when we say standard, it's normal. Something that is normal, that's something average, and so on. Most of characters in the Bible, even though we kind of do not like the idea, they are like most of them are extraordinary characters. Extraordinary characters means they are above standard. They are not like a normal people. Normal people, in sense, they do eat, they do sleep, and they do sin. In that sense, they are normal. But the position and the power they have, and then the extraordinary spirituality, for example, Paul, the Saint Paul, he is extraordinary. We cannot even, try to be we cannot reach that standard. His standard-wise is very high, so he's an extraordinary. Jesus, of course, extraordinary. King David, yeah. King Solomon, and Moses, Abraham, Noah, all these characters in the Bible, they are extraordinary, beyond standard. Joseph, who went to Egypt and began his life as a slave, then go over every step of that ladder to the top and become the second powerful man in that whole land of Egypt. That's extraordinary. So we could say they are like a beyond standard. Frameworks. You need to build a certain framework in understanding biblical characters. And that framework also applies to yourself and then also to people around you. When you don't have this framework, you are very confused. There is no right or wrong framework. I could say there could be some better or less better, just good framework. But all frameworks are good as long as it works. What are some of the frameworks? Let me give you an example. One of the framework that most people today use is whether this person is rich or poor, whether he or she earns, how much money he or she makes. There will be one framework that we commonly have. In Korea, girls, they like tall guys. That's kind of framework common to today's young ladies who are looking for a date or someone to marry. So those are kind of frameworks that you develop, and but we don't look for whether this person is rich or not in the Bible. Our framework is what kind of person is this person is. One of the measurement would be godliness. That's one of the framework that we are looking into. And then another framework would be something called obedience. Is one very important key framework or the category, criteria, or barometers that we use to understand or analyze or judge a character in the Bible. So these are all measurements. So you need to develop a certain measurement, but we want that to be biblical rather than, secular or rather than something else. So whether this person is a tall or short, it doesn't really matter. But in the story of gospel, there's a guy called, whose name is Zacchaeus. And he was a tax collector. And tax collector, he was a Jewish, but he's a tax collector, meaning he collects tax from the people, general people. And when they were not under Roman Empire, tax was like a 10% of your income. But under the Roman Empire, when they become colony, they charge 20%, twice more tax. And that 10% goes to who? Roman Empire. Another 10% goes to Jewish government. And then they usually charge another 10%. So actually it's 30%. And that 10% goes into the pockets of tax collector. So that's why they hated, they didn't like tax collectors. So this Zacchaeus, he was not only a tax collector, he was short. And people hated him for being tax collector and kind of ignored him for being short. But we don't care whether he's short or tall. We just look into his godliness and obedience and the heart for Jesus. Okay. Perception and paradigm. These are the very important key words when you're doing any study, any academic study. Even for the life, for your just normal everyday existence, the daily life, it makes a difference, very different. There are people who does not have this perception and paradigm. I mean, they do have paradigm and perception, but it is not organized, it is not systematic, it is not integrated. I want you to have, by the end of doing this character study, or to even begin your character study, there has to be a very integrated system of paradigms. For Christians today, at least for my students and my Christian students, whom I pastor and teach, I try my best effort to build them, help them to build their own biblical perception and paradigms. So what the meaning, when we say I am a Christian or you are a Christian, that means we share same perception and paradigms that is in the Bible. So the Bible basically not only teaches us the way of salvation, how to be saved and how to end up in the heaven. But Bible also teaches us about this existence, earthly existence. We have to live 20, 30, 40, 50, even 100 years on earth. And that is very important too. So to have good and biblically correct living on earth, we need to have this perception, biblical perception, or biblical paradigms. And the many of today's church is not teaching. Unfortunately, we are not teaching these biblical paradigms anymore. We used to do that. The church used to do that, but not anymore. The church became so religious. They are only Christian when they come to church, and then once you are out of the church door, then you become just normal people, just as any other people. That's not right. That's not correct. It's because you don't have no solid paradigm, the framework, way to perceive, understand. So the one major thing to fill this blank with the belief. Belief is a system of perception or worldview or paradigm looking into the reality. Because the reality is the same, but the way that we see and understand and interpret the reality is different from a person to person. Everyone has different worldview, different paradigms, and different perception. So that when you have different belief or belief system, then your existence is going to be very different according to what you believe. And for us Christians, this would be the Bible or biblical belief. Sorry to say this, but for socialists, would be socialism, or I think for my understanding, in China or Korea, and then there is a strong belief, something called nationalism, very pride in being Chinese or being Korean, and that kind of drives who they are. There are some people who does that, and I think that the government and the school, that the education is teaching, us to be nationalistic. It's different from what we call patriotism. Patriotism is love for the country and love for the people of my nation. But nationalism is having self-pride, comparing us Korean to other people. For us, usually Korean, compare us to Chinese and Japanese, because we're close, the neighbors. And we want to be better than Chinese or better than Japanese. And I think that's not right, either, whether it happens in China, Korea, Japan. That's how the government and the schools educate you. And but the Bible says we are all same people, and either you love God or you do not, or you're going to be saved or you're not, and you're going to be either Christ-like or you're not. So that's the kind of paradigm that we Christians should have. Unfortunately, there are some Christians who say they are Christian but being very nationalistic, and I don't think it's the right thing to do. Anyway, So when we see the characters in the Bible, we want to have this kind of measurement to see who they are and how they are. Another word for that would be platform, framework, or blueprint. These are all the same, but used in a different profession or different field. For example, blueprint is used in the construction industry or the engineering industry. If you're an engineer, you need to be able to read the blueprint, the diagram. The framework is more of construction. When you construct a house, you need to build a framework. Or if you're making something, the things that you need to have a framework. And even your car that you drive, it does have a framework, and then you put the body on. So framework, a platform, is something that's a base. Paradoxical existence. This is one framework or the paradigm that you want to remember as you try to understand biblical stories. The character is a part of a biblical narrative, as I said in the beginning of this class, early in the first portion of the lessons. In the Bible, one of the major framework or the paradigm that runs through every biblical story and most biblical writing is a paradox. Because the reality that we live in is paradoxical. Paradox means it's contradiction in theory, but in reality, that contradiction does exist. There's a word in Chinese, Korean pronunciation would be motion. That means the spare and the show. You know the word.
Yeah, 矛盾.
And there's a spare that can penetrate any shield.
Yeah, yes.
And then there's a shield that can protect any spear.
Yes.
And in theory, it cannot exist.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of paradox. So life, the reality is full of paradox. See, let's, for example, these are the two different things that cannot coexist in theory. But in reality, it does exist in us. For me, there's an evil that I cannot deny, and there is goodness inside me. This both things exist, and sometimes it's simultaneous at the same time. So that's paradox. And the Bible does acknowledge or recognize that reality of good and evil being together. So life is full of paradox. When there is a happiness, at the same time, there is misfortune. It comes together sometimes. And we think life should be happy and safe all the time, but in reality, it is not. So that's kind of paradox. And also like a Trinity, if you know the word, God is three and three is one. I mean, it's not even possible theoretically, but it is true in reality. So that's also paradox. So God himself does have this paradoxical element. For Jesus, we say Jesus is fully man and fully God. And God and man cannot be one, but it does become real in the Jesus of Nazareth. So that's what we call biblical paradox. So when we try to understand a human being or the biblical characters, we need to see these characters are human beings, and human beings are indeed paradoxical. Not of these. So, see that picture. It cannot exist for real. It cannot happen. That kind of shape does not exist in reality. But as you see, the drawing, it is real there. It is picturable. You can make a drawing out of it. So that's a kind of paradox example. Biblical paradox. There are a lot of paradox in just reality, but in the Bible, one, God's word contains many paradoxes. These are the statements that appear contradictory on the surface when paired next to another, just like a good and evil, or darkness and light. Understood in context, meaning in reality, context, another word for reality would be context. In reality, such statements complement one another to reveal a more full picture of truth. So the truth, many times, is paradoxical. Jesus teaches a lot of these paradoxes. If you want to live, you need to give up your life. It doesn't make sense. I mean, grammatically and content-wise, it's contradicting. But Jesus is saying to live, you need to die. And it is true. But we understand what it means as a believer. But it takes some time and some deep thinking to understand that paradox. So those are like a biblical paradox. Bible paradox. There's one. The blue button is true, and the red button is false. It doesn't make sense. It's contrary. So that's how the biblical paradox is. Chiasm. That's one of the difficult concepts to understand, especially us for non-Western. But chiasm is one of the major framework and paradigm that appears over and over again in the Bible. This will be the basic, drawing to understand chiasm. There are several elements in understanding this chiasm. One, there's a beginning and the end. So any biblical story or history for us, there's going to be the beginning and the end. And then there's a positive and negative, or good or evil, light and darkness. Life and death. So there are two dimensions, and it reverses. So evil becomes good and good becomes evil or overcomes. So starts with the evil, and evil, it fails, positive to negative. And the good starts with a negative, weak, but eventually it wins. So that's kind of idea in the chiasm. And this framework is very common and popular in Hollywood movies. It's not like that in today's most modern movies, but if you go back like 20, 30 years ago, or 50, 60 years ago, the movies made in like 1950, 1960, and even to the 70s, they follow this very structure in setting their the drama or movie plot. So it is very common for Western mind, but we don't have this kind of reversal of mind in our culture, in Asian culture. This is rare. Even though there is something called, I cannot write it in Chinese, 권선징악, which that's pronounced Korean. 권선징악 means promoting the goodness and then judging the evil. So there is some idea of chiasm in that word, but it's not that popular for us. But in Western culture, this is a very basic framework. And another, the understanding of the chiasm is that everything that comes down to this very focal points, and it starts over from here and back to reverse. So in Bible, this is where the cross comes in, where the Jesus Messiah comes in. Everything comes down to the appearing of Messiah into the human history in physical form and human form. Then, because of Jesus Christ, it begins to reverse. So evil, the evil begins to fail, and become negative, being judged at the end. While the goodness begins to flourish and to grow and overcome evil and wins at the end. So that's how the Bible is pictured. So this is called Old Testament, and this is called New Testament. So we are living in New Testament period, and eventually we'll have the end, the final end, of what we call the final judgment, and then something called the new heaven and new earth is coming to us. That's the kingdom of God that's going to be realized, and that's going to be completed when Jesus comes back. So that's the main structure. So if you try to understand the Bible history, this would be a very helpful framework or paradigm. And chiasm, again, is one of the picture in biblical narratives. So any story in the Bible does follow this basic framework. And as we read the Bible stories, especially the Old Testament stories, always remind ourselves of two things: paradox and chiasm. So that's going to help us to formulate and understand and figure out the characters within this big picture or plot or framework. Okay, I think the time's up for today. And thank you for coming and
Thank you for
listening.
teaching. Thank
And
you
we'll
for
see
time.
you next week. And again, next week, we're gonna have a class.
Okay.
But try to watch on video. Thank
All right,
you.
all right, thank you.
Yeah, bye.
Bye-bye.